James, who turned 18 in December 2025, has only recently begun embracing the attention that comes with his role in the royal family. The freshly graduated teen is the son of Prince Edward, Duke of Edinburgh, the youngest brother of King Charles, and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh.
There are moments in the life of an institution that do not announce themselves with fanfare. They do not arrive on the front pages of newspapers before they happen. They do not trend on social media in the days leading up to them. They simply occur, quietly and with great deliberateness, and then the world slowly begins to understand what it has just witnessed. The acceptance of a princely title by James Alexander, the son of Prince Edward and Sophie, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, is precisely that kind of moment. It is not a moment of noise. It is a moment of consequence. And if you take the time to understand what it truly represents, you will recognize it as one of the most carefully constructed, deeply meaningful acts of royal duty this generation has ever produced. To understand why this matters, you must first set aside everything you think you know about the British royal family from the headlines of the last decade. Set aside the drama. Set aside the tabloid narratives and the streaming confessionals and the transatlantic press wars. Strip all of that away and look at what remains. What remains is an ancient institution navigating a modern world, searching for the right people to carry it forward with dignity, intelligence, and genuine conviction. And in James Alexander, that institution has found exactly what it was looking for. Not by accident. Not by luck. But because of choices made over 18 years with extraordinary patience and extraordinary wisdom. James Alexander Philip Theo Mountbatten Windsor. That is the full weight of the name he now carries into his official royal duties as a Prince of the United Kingdom. And every single part of that name matters. James, a name with deep British royal heritage. Alexander, a name that evokes strength and leadership across centuries of European history. Philip, the name that links him directly and deliberately to his grandfather, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, the man who stood beside Queen Elizabeth II for over 70 years and who shaped the internal architecture of the modern British monarchy with a discipline and a clarity of purpose that few figures in royal history have ever matched. And Theo, a name that speaks of the divine, of purpose, of a calling that goes beyond mere circumstance. The Philip in that name is the key that unlocks the deeper meaning of this moment. It was not placed there carelessly. In royal families, names are never merely names. They are statements of intention. They are inheritances made visible. When Prince Edward and Sophie chose to place the name Philip among their sons' given names, they were doing something that went far beyond sentiment or honor. They were declaring a continuity. They were saying, in the language of dynasties, that this child carries something of that man forward into the future. And now, as James steps into his official title as a prince, the world is beginning to understand just how literally that declaration was meant. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was one of the most singular figures in the history of the House of Windsor. He was not born into the British royal family. He came to it from the outside, from a background of European royalty and personal hardship, and he forged himself into the defining force of one of the world's most enduring institutions. He was disciplined in a way that bordered on severity. He was intellectually rigorous in an era when royals were not expected to be. He had a deep and serious engagement with science, technology, and the natural world that manifested in his passionate support for the Duke of Edinburgh's award, a program that has shaped the lives of millions of young people across the globe. He was, above all, a man who understood that the monarchy was not a privilege to be enjoyed but a responsibility to be discharged. Every single day. Without complaint. Without fanfare. Without ever placing his own comfort or his own desires above the duty he had accepted. These are not small qualities. These are not the qualities that come easily or naturally to most people, particularly most young people growing up in an environment of extraordinary privilege. And yet, if you look at James Alexander today, at the way he carries himself, at the choices he has made, at the manner in which he has prepared for this moment, you see every single one of those qualities reflected back. The patience, the discipline, the intellectual seriousness, the willingness to subordinate the personal to the institutional, The understanding that a title is not a reward but a responsibility. James did not simply inherit these qualities through the accident of blood. He absorbed them, deepened them, and made them his own. The story of how that happened begins with his mother. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, is a figure who has been consistently and significantly underestimated by the mainstream royal commentary, and that underestimation is a mistake of considerable proportion. Sophie came into the royal family as a commoner, as a woman without title or aristocratic background, and she brought with her something that is rarer in that environment than any of the things that money or lineage can provide. She brought common sense. She brought a grounded perspective on what it means to live in the real world, to navigate ordinary life, to be judged by your actions rather than your status. And she brought an extraordinary clarity of vision about how she wanted to raise her children. The decision that Sophie and Edward made when their children were born was, by the standards of royal tradition, genuinely radical. They chose not to style their children as His or Her Royal Highness. They chose not to give them princely titles in childhood. They chose, instead, to raise them as the children of an earl, with all the responsibility and none of the automatic elevation that a royal title confers. Lady Louise and James were sent to ordinary schools. They took public transport. They lived as closely to normal life as their circumstances permitted. And they were expected from a very young age to earn the respect they received rather than to assume it as their birthright. This decision was not universally understood at the time. There were people within the wider royal establishment who questioned its wisdom. There were commentators who wondered whether Sophie and Edward were making a mistake, whether they were depriving their children of something important, whether the lack of title would be a disadvantage rather than an asset. Those questions have now been answered definitively. They have been answered by the young man who stood at the center of a South African royal tour and commanded the genuine respect of everyone in the room without a single royal title to his name. They have been answered by the young man who stood vigil at Westminster Hall at the age of 14 with a composure that left seasoned royal observers lost for adequate words. They have been answered by the decision James himself has now made, to accept his princely title not as a claim of status but as an acceptance of duty. Think for a moment about what it means to be 18 years old and to have the option of a royal title available to you and to choose to wait. To choose to watch. To choose to continue learning and preparing rather than reaching out for the name and the prestige that are legally and constitutionally yours to take. In a world that is saturated with the language of self-promotion and personal branding, in a culture that rewards the loudest voice and the most dramatic gesture, the restraint that James showed in the years leading up to this formal acceptance is not just unusual. It is almost shocking. It speaks of a depth of character and a clarity of purpose that most people twice his age have not achieved. Those who have observed James closely in the years of his quiet preparation speak of a young man who was never simply waiting passively. He was studying. He was reading. He was engaging with the subjects that he understood would define the most important challenges of his generation. His interest in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics is not the polite, superficial engagement of someone who attends a laboratory opening and smiles for the cameras. It is the genuine, sustained intellectual engagement of someone who actually wants to understand how things work. He has immersed himself in the science of conservation, in the engineering of sustainable systems, in the strategic complexities of defense and security. These are not decorative interests. These are the foundations of a working royal who intends to be genuinely useful to the causes he champions rather than simply lending his name to them. This matters enormously in the context of what the British monarchy needs to be in the 21st century. King Charles III has spent decades making the case, often against considerable resistance, that the royal family must engage with the serious issues of the age not merely symbolically but substantively. His work on organic farming, on architectural heritage, on ecological sustainability was dismissed as eccentric for years before the world caught up with his thinking. James represents the next generation of that same intellectual seriousness, brought to bear on the challenges of a digital, data-driven, environmentally pressured world. The king has recognized this. Those close to him describe a quiet but profound sense of relief and pride in the nephew who has emerged as the embodiment of exactly the kind of royal the institution needs. The relationship between James and the Prince of Wales, William, is another dimension of this story that deserves careful attention because it is central to understanding the strategic significance of James's formal entry into the working royal family. William is the future king. He carries that weight every day with a dedication and a seriousness that is not always visible to the outside world, but is unmistakable to those who work closely with him. He is a man of great capability and genuine commitment to his duty. He is also a man who has navigated the last several years with a reduced inner circle, carrying the weight of institutional leadership in circumstances that have been more complex and more personally demanding than anyone outside that situation can fully appreciate. What William needs, what every leader in a position of profound institutional responsibility needs, is not just capable colleagues. He needs someone he can trust absolutely. Someone whose loyalty is not contingent on personal advantage or professional calculation. Someone who is there because they have chosen to be there, with full knowledge of what that choice costs and what it requires. James is that person. The relationship between them is described by those closest to both as something that goes beyond the formal hierarchy of the royal family. It is a genuine alliance, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what the crown is and what it demands. James looks to William with a combination of genuine admiration and intellectual engagement that makes for a truly productive partnership. William looks to James with the recognition that he has found in his young cousin something that the architecture of the royal family does not always provide: a reliable, principled, freely committed ally. The age gap between them, which might seem like an obstacle to genuine partnership, is in fact one of the things that makes the relationship work. James is young enough to learn from William without competition, to benefit from his experience and his guidance without the ego friction that so often complicates relationships between people of similar seniority. But he is mature enough, formed enough, serious enough in his engagement with his responsibilities to be a genuine intellectual partner rather than simply a junior figure nodding along to his senior's direction. This balance is rare. The palace knows it. And the formal elevation of James to his princely title is, among other things, a recognition that this partnership is ready to operate at the highest level of royal institutional life. Let us speak directly about the moment that announced to the world who James Alexander truly is, because it is impossible to understand the significance of his title acceptance without returning to Westminster Hall in September of 2022. Queen Elizabeth II had died. The nation was in mourning. The world was watching. And in that ancient chamber, illuminated by candlelight, guarded by the most senior members of the armed forces, the body of the most recognizable woman on earth lay in state, while hundreds of thousands of people filed past in silence to pay their respects. The grandchildren of the Queen stood vigil, and among them stood James, who was 14 years old. 14 years old. It is worth pausing on that for a full moment and letting it settle. 14 is not an age of composure. 14 is not an age of institutional dignity and public serenity. 14 is the age of self-consciousness, of uncertainty, of the overwhelming desire to disappear into the background rather than to stand at the center of the most watched ceremonial moment in a generation. And yet James stood there with his head bowed and his bearing absolutely steady, with the quiet gravity of someone who understood exactly where he was and what he was doing and why it mattered. He was not performing. He was not straining to appear older or more composed than his years. He was simply present, fully and completely, in the way that genuine character rather than practiced display produces. Veteran royal correspondents who have covered decades of royal events spoke afterward with an unusual candor about what they had witnessed. The consensus was not simply that James had done well for his age. The consensus was that James had demonstrated something that age had very little to do with. He had demonstrated the particular quality of stillness that comes from a person who knows who they are and why they are there. That quality cannot be taught in the conventional sense. It can be cultivated, it can be encouraged, it can be created through the right environment and the right guidance, but ultimately it has to come from within. And in James, it clearly does. Those who understand the tradition of fly fishing in the Scottish Highlands will understand something that outsiders might initially miss about why the stories of James's afternoons at Balmoral with his grandfather matter so much. Fly fishing is not a sport. Or rather, it is not merely a sport. It is a discipline of attention. It requires the practitioner to become so completely present in their environment that the boundary between observer and observed begins to dissolve. You must understand the water. You must understand the wind, the light, the temperature, the mood of the ecosystem around you. You must achieve a quality of silence that is not merely the absence of sound but the absence of distraction, the absence of the internal noise that most of us carry through our lives without even noticing it. Prince Philip understood this. He used it, those long quiet hours beside the River Dee in the Scottish Highlands, not just as recreation but as education. Not formal education. Something deeper. The education of character through direct encounter with the natural world and its demands. James received that education. He sat beside his grandfather on cold Highland mornings when other children might have been looking for warmer entertainments. He learned to wait without impatience. He learned to observe without imposing his own expectations on what he was observing. He learned that the world does not yield its secrets to those who demand them, but to those who are still and attentive enough to receive them. These lessons are not metaphorical when applied to royal service. They are directly, practically applicable to every element of public life that James will now be formally engaged in. The patience to listen when others want to speak. The observation to understand a room before trying to influence it. The stillness to project authority without aggression. The deep attention to the person in front of you that makes them feel genuinely seen and genuinely heard rather than processed and moved on. This last quality, the ability to make people feel genuinely heard, was on vivid display during the international tour that served as James's first major introduction to the world stage as a representative of the Crown. The details of that tour have been analyzed extensively by those who cover royal affairs professionally, and what they describe is consistent and remarkable. James did not perform royal engagement. He practiced it in its truest sense. He was interested in the people he met not as recipients of royal attention, but as individuals with lives and perspectives and knowledge that he genuinely wanted to understand. He asked questions that demonstrated he had prepared seriously for each interaction, that he understood the context and the complexity of the work being done. He listened in a way that is vanishingly rare in high-profile public life, with his full attention directed outward rather than inward, with no visible calculation of how he was appearing or what impression he was making. The people who met him on that tour, conservation leaders, community representatives, government officials, veteran diplomats, came away with a consistent response that the journalists covering the tour found themselves almost reluctant to write because it seemed to resist the language of ordinary royal coverage. They were moved. Not charmed, not impressed in the conventional celebrity sense, but genuinely moved by an encounter with a young man who seemed, in every interaction, to be completely present and completely committed to understanding the person in front of him. This is James's greatest gift. It is the gift that Sophie's upbringing and Philip's mentorship combined to produce. And it is the gift that the monarchy most needs in the world it now inhabits. We cannot speak of this moment without acknowledging directly the context in which it occurs. The British monarchy has faced significant challenges over the past decade. The departure of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex from royal duties created a gap in the working royal family that was never simply about numbers. It was about the kind of young, internationally recognizable, publicly engaged royal presence that the institution depends upon to remain relevant and vital in the public imagination, particularly among younger generations. Various adjustments have been made. Various approaches have been tried. But the fundamental question of where the next generation of committed, capable, publicly trusted working royals would come from remained more pressing than many acknowledged openly. James's elevation answers that question in a way that no structural adjustment or institutional rearrangement could. He does not fill a gap left by someone else. He creates something new. He represents the emergence, fully formed and thoroughly prepared, of exactly the kind of royal that the 21st century version of this ancient institution needs. Young, but not inexperienced. Intellectually serious, but never remote or inaccessible. Genuinely engaged with the real world and its real challenges, but absolutely clear about his commitment to the institution and to the service that commitment demands. He is, in the language of the structural engineers, the palace sometimes resembles in its internal discourse a load-bearing addition rather than a decorative one. There is a dimension to this story that extends beyond the palace and beyond the commentariat, and beyond even the millions of people who follow royal affairs with sustained and genuine interest. It extends to the question of what stories a society tells itself about the values it considers most important. For a long time, the dominant royal story, the one that consumed the most attention and generated the most discussion, was a story about the conflict between personal fulfillment and institutional duty, about the irreconcilability of individual desire and public responsibility. That story has real human truth in it. These are real tensions that real people experience. But it is not the only royal story available. And it is certainly not the most important one. James offers a different story. He offers the story of someone who looked at those same tensions and made a different choice. Not because the tensions were not real for him. Not because the appeal of private life was absent. Not because he was unaware of what accepting a royal title and a life of royal service would cost in terms of personal freedom and ordinary human autonomy. He was entirely aware. He was raised by a mother who made sure he understood the world he was choosing, not the world he was escaping into. And having understood it fully, he chose it. He chose it with the same deliberateness that his grandfather chose to stand beside Elizabeth II through more than 70 years of service. He chose it as a free act, made in full knowledge of its cost and its weight. That kind of choice, freely made and fully informed, is the foundation upon which genuine public trust is built. People can sense the difference between someone who is doing their duty because they have no alternative and someone who is doing their duty because they have genuinely chosen to. James belongs to the second category in a way that is visible and tangible, and that resonates with the part of the public that is not interested in celebrity monarchy or performative royalty but in the real thing. The monarchy as an institution of service, of continuity, of something that endures because the people who carry it forward genuinely believe in what it represents. As the formal process of his title acceptance completes and the letters patent are sealed and James Alexander Philip Theo Mountbatten Windsor takes his place in the official architecture of the House of Windsor as a Prince of the United Kingdom, it is worth taking a moment to consider what Prince Philip himself would have made of it. He was not a sentimental man. He was not given to easy praise or warm public declarations of pride. He believed that character was demonstrated through action over time, not announced in speeches or celebrated in ceremonies. He would have watched James without saying very much. He would have observed the steadiness and the seriousness and the willingness to do the work without seeking the spotlight. And somewhere in that characteristic silence, he would have recognized himself. That is the deepest meaning of this moment. Not the title. Not the official ceremony. Not the constitutional formality of the letters patent. The deepest meaning is the continuation of a philosophy, a way of being in the world that prioritizes substance over appearance, service over status, the long disciplined arc of genuine achievement over the short bright flash of public attention. Prince Philip planted the seeds of that philosophy in his youngest grandson on cold mornings by a Scottish river. Sophie watered it through 18 years of revolutionary, courageous, quietly radical parenting. James tended it through his own daily choices, his own patient preparation, his own deliberate and conscious decision to earn what he could have simply claimed. The harvest is now. The prince is confirmed. The heir to Philip's legacy has stepped forward. And the British monarchy, quietly and without fanfare, has taken one of the most significant steps in its modern evolution. Not into the past. Into the future. Into a future where duty is chosen rather than imposed, where service is genuine rather than performed, and where the most powerful thing a young royal can offer the institution and the country is not their name, not their title, not their blood, but the quality of their presence, their attention, and their commitment. James Alexander has offered all of it. Freely. Deliberately. Completely. That is what it means to be Philip's heir. And that is why this moment, quiet as it is, matters more than it may yet appear.